have to thank you for that. I sound important, so that was wonderful. According to legend, around 524 BCE, the lyric poet Simonides of Chios recited a long poem he had written specifically for a banquet. When he finished, he left the banqueting hall, and almost immediately the roof collapsed, killing nearly everyone inside. So squashed were the banquet guests that their identities could not be determined. Simonides stepped up and, by recreating the banqueting hall in his mind, recalled where everyone had been sitting while he recited his poem. Simonides was using a popular trick that was useful for orators, scholars, and priests, and probably you, to remember things. By envisioning a particular location, either real or imagined, and key factors or words associated with that location or parts of that location, a person can cram an amazing amount of information into the brain to be recalled instantly. It's how long speeches were memorized by classical orators. It's how huge chunks of history were memorized by 19th century school children. And it's also how medieval parishioners recalled morality lessons and biblical narratives that had been taught to them. The use of a location as a memory receptacle for various amounts of data is called the Method of Loci. And this is not quite the Loki that I meant, but even an anti-hero has very important things he needs to remember. And I promise that the image won't let you forget the name of the process. But here's the real deal. Loci comes from locus, which means place. So you associate things you want to remember with a place. When you imagine that place, the memories or the information that you place there are waiting for you to unpack them when you next view or think of this particular location. Now, a simple way to do this is to envision something very familiar to you that has compartments or landmarks in which you can mentally store information. So Loki up here can plug each of the people in his to destroy list into a section of Dad's fancy throne room wall, and when he thinks of that wall, he can keep track of who he needs to destroy and perhaps what they did to earn that honor. So this is the simplest form of the method of Loci. These memory devices and tricks can become very complicated, and an endless amount of detail can be added as needed. For more intricate memory aids, the use of mentally recalled architectural structures has been historically the most popular method of Loci. 16th century philosopher Giulio Camillo created a memory aid in the shape of a classical arena to contain his ideas about the creation of the world. In its simplest form, the theater of memory holds the names of classical deities involved with world creation, and they get the box seats down in front here. Those are the important gods. As you move through the theater, categories of the classical world are added along with the deity's contribution to that category. The information stashed in various places within a mnemonic construction like this can contain an infinite amount of data. And often a keyword for each department acts as a kind of hook for longer strands of information. So keywords are important. Even though this is a simple structure on its face, it can become very complex. Roman rhetors liked to use a building facade, which they mentally envisioned from a distance of about 30 feet away, just close enough to see the details of sculpture, windows, columns, etc., but far enough away that you could see the facade as a whole. Architectural elements would be filled with some sort of information to be recalled. The rememberer literally builds the structure in his mind, using information as the building blocks. Sometimes the exterior of a building would be imagined with symbolic decorative elements. Likewise, the interior of an imagined space could be filled with symbolic furniture or ornaments. So this is a 17th century mnemonic device, all made up of keywords or notes or images that are meaningful to Robert Flood, but the concept is the same that was used in the classical era. The complexity of the structure built in the mind depends on how much information has been used as construction or decorative material. The method of Loci, in conjunction with or in the form of imagined architectural structures as the key repository, is called a memory palace. Also used as teaching tools, you have memory palaces teaching students history. This is called the Temple of Time, and it is a history of the world. With repeated mental visitation of the Temple of Time, you, as a student of history, could learn everything contained in this structure. It looks simple, doesn't it? The floor is constructed of geographical boundaries, which, as you can see up here especially, do not always change or shift in a neat linear fashion, beginning in the rear of the structure here with the creation of the world and moving forward through various empires and formations of nations until the mid-19th century up here, when this print was made. The columns represent leaders of each century, upon whom the key figures in the arts and politics, etc., rest as the roof of the temple. And because the fourth wall is open, we can add to the structure and bring it up to date. Imaginary structures built for memory purposes are entirely customizable. They are reusable, a series of cubby holes and surfaces in which we can stash things we need to remember, whether it's a list of important figures in world history or a grocery list or a bunch of people we need to destroy. There are some problems with this method, though. The examples of memory palace we have seen so far have been labeled. They tell us exactly what we're looking at and what each compartment holds as its memory or its information. But sometimes things remembered are inaccessible to certain audiences. The Memory Palace drawing series by Detroit artist Sally Schluter Tardella incorporates the use of very specific personal memories in the creation of elaborate mnemonic constructions, all left tantalizingly empty. Schluter Tardella built these memory palaces out of ink, whiteout, sometimes offset newsprint that have parts of the words obscured, in order to keep the memories of extremely personal events and moments alive in her own mind, but she has not supplied us, the viewer, with labels. So all of those niches, those levers, those eggs, invite us to fill the empty spaces up with our own memories or mnemonic hooks. And as they are presented here, the meaning behind each drawing is not immediately clear to us because we did not initially create these memory palaces. We do not hold memories of our lives or our memories in these drawings, but they hold those of someone we do not know. And this is going to be important to remember in just a little bit. Where's the Middle Ages? There's the Middle Ages. Memory palace constructions were used in the Middle Ages most often by priests and monks or other clerics to learn texts, lessons, and sermons. The Tower of Wisdom, an example of which you see here, in its simplest iteration is a memory palace that teaches the fundamental tenets of Christian behavior and the way those are manifested in daily life. So the foundation of the structure down here at the bottom comprises the basic and most important building blocks of Christianity. This is your foundation stone: prayer, confession, penitence, etc. These occur within the inner self. And as you work your way up the structure with those acts, they guide you as fundamental traits. Each action's level becomes more public as you work your way up this structure here. You keep yourself in check by mentally walking through this tower that you have built, remembering these traits and moral lessons that are attached to each building block of the Tower of Wisdom. So this is an imagined religious structure. But the church itself functioned as a memory palace, especially during the rebirth of monumental and architectural sculpture in the late 11th and early 12th centuries, the Romanesque period in southern France, Spain, and parts of Italy. The most straightforward use of architectural sculpture as a memory device is the highly readable imagery at the front door of certain Romanesque churches that reminded the viewer not only of a broad narrative, like the Last Judgment, which was very popular during this period, but extraneous information about that narrative, such as details on the fate of certain people in apocalyptic situations or esoteric theological minutiae. Depending on the education of the viewer, these images could be peeled like an onion, with recollection of a very rudimentary meaning on first sight, through various levels of exegetical analysis to be unpacked by theologians or clerics, so people who knew more could find deeper meanings and other memories packed in these images. It also reminds people what the church was for. This kind of sculpture is broadcasting, it's advertising. This is headline news that appeals to the masses. Portal imagery, such as tympanum sculpture, was recognizable to nearly everyone passing by in a medieval town in Western Europe. Recognizable composition and iconography, even though each tympanum sculpture is unique to its particular church, was the norm. This is a brand, it's a logo. It represents the rewards of salvation which you could obtain inside the church, and it also represented the consequences of bad behavior, sometimes shown in graphic and violent detail. It's my favorite. At Conk, the punishments are severe, even for seemingly minor crimes. A poacher, where is my poacher? Poacher being roasted by some sort of devil bunny up here. There is a counterfeiter over here having molten metal poured down his throat by a demon. A person who made music outside the service of the church, profane music, is having a little harp strung with his tongue as it's being pulled out of his mouth. It's likely that scenes like this were customized to reflect the actions of its worst parishioners. In rural France, such as where Conques is located, it would absolutely not be unheard of to hunt on the land of the local lord or count against the law, or to strike a little extra coinage to enhance one's income, or to play music or sing or dance in the street instead of at church. So these punishments seem to not fit the crime, but imagery is a powerful motivator. An important thing about medieval imagery, viewing was not a passive activity like it is today, but it was interactive and synesthetic. Imagery looked back at you in the Middle Ages. It made sounds and smells in the viewer's mind, and viewing was an active exploit. So this would have been terrifying to people who might actually have done these things, and they're being reminded about how serious their actions are. So the tympanum fits the bill of active imagery because it prompts people to act. People see the tympanum, it reminds them that maybe they need to take some steps to clean up their act because Judgment Day is coming. And of course, the tympanum is always watching and always looking back at you. It's likely that clerics would have proselytized outside, using sculpture as a visual aid to enhance the parishioners' recollection of the sermon or homily or warnings. The tympanum is a memory device, and we today know most of the information packed in it, or we could find it easily, because it derives from a known text. But most Romanesque churches have other sculpture on other parts of the church, secondary sculpture, like corbels or metopes or capitals that you see here. And depending on the size of the church and the financial state of the parish, they may not have a sculpted tympanum at all. So my research interest focuses on how this kind of sculpture was used and what it means. And there are problems with deciphering secondary sculpture like this. First of all, secondary sculpture is symbolic. It isn't narrative. It does not have an overarching story attached to it to tell us what we're looking at or what the meaning of the sculpture is. The arrangement of secondary sculpture is unique to each church, so there is no uniform or definitive way of knowing what sculptural elements should go together, or if they even should go together. Sometimes you have to consider architectural elements like windows, buttresses, columns, pilasters, etc., that create rhythms and visual phrases in order to figure out how to read this kind of sculpture. But why does secondary sculpture have to mean something anyway? Maybe it could just be decoration? Not likely, because first of all, the church paid money for this stuff. Some churches only have a handful of corbels as decoration. They would not have wasted money on visual fluff, so they're getting their money's worth. Second, the church was very careful about the messages it generated. It was not about to let some unsupervised sculptor put a collection of random, weird images on its prime real estate. Third, there are patterns inherent in the placement and use of motifs that parallel the use of similar motifs and of writing practice in texts from the same period. And the parity between sculpture and texts occurs too frequently to be coincidental. For example, there are memory aids all over corbel tables. We see these kinds of devices frequently in the margins of manuscripts of sermons and other texts that were meant to be memorized. These types of mnemonic devices are prevalent in corbel vocabulary and the most straightforward kind of corbel motif to understand. If you look at these all have multiple elements, multiple compartments, and you put memory hooks or narrative strands in each petal, in each rod, in each box of one of these so you can unpack it upon viewing. These are very basic mnemonic devices, very similar to Loki's wall that we saw earlier. And like the mnemonic devices of antiquity, these are customizable and they are reusable. You can pack anything you want into a device like this to be remembered later. The use of animals, especially birds, in medieval texts acted as a sort of bold print. It indicated something very important to remember within a text, was sitting next to or nearby a bird or an animal. In sculpture, these motifs are usually placed within a visual phrase, often relating to other sculptural elements by pose or basic shape or other attributes. Additionally, almost every bird or other animal found in secondary sculpture is also found in popular medieval morality texts like the Physiologus or Bestiaries, which offered descriptions of various beasts, both real and imagined, along with a strong moral component. So these corbel critters that you see here not only act as punctuation, they act as mnemonics that prompt the viewer to recall the moral character or the story behind each of them. Now, establishing a visual phrase can be aided by architectural features, and that can help immensely when you're trying to figure out what fits together. So things like windows, these engaged columns here, form a type of rhythm. So when you come up to a church like this, you can kind of form already in your mind an idea of things that might go together. That rhythm is very important, and it's an important factor of reading as well. You need a rhythm to the words to figure out what fits together. So when we think about forming phrases with architectural components, these are fairly simple. You have collections of 2 corbels. This has metopes in between, and these are just pairs of corbels like couplets. But let's look at one that has 4 corbels in it. Here's a well-defined corbel phrase that's set off almost parenthetically by a set of buttresses here. There's some interesting linking in the imagery going on. First, you have something called co-signification. And a simple explanation of co-signification is when one thing takes on the quality of another thing next to it or near it. It's kind of a guilt by association situation. In terms of textual use, if you have the words yellow and dog in a phrase next to each other, the dog will tend to take on the quality yellow as you read it. That's co-signification. So here you have man and beast that are related to each other because they appear together within the confines of these buttresses. And you also have them related by shape and pose. For example, you have this nice diagonal line formed by our smith's hammer that mimics the diagonal line that's implied by, I'm going to call this an eagle's head here. So those two go together for their isomorphic correspondence. They are related in shape to each other, the way they occupy the corbel. And the same can be said for the corbels at the beginning and the end of this phrase. We'll call this one an owl over here. He's broad, his feet occupy the lower corners of the corbel, and so is the bishop. He's also broad, and his little feet fit down here in the lower corners as well. So there's some correspondence with shape happening between this figure and this figure and this figure and this figure. So we have these images taking on aspects of one another, attributes of one another, and that's the tricky part, is knowing exactly what that means. So this phrase consists of 4 elements that are enclosed as a group by buttresses. They're linked together by their shapes, by their placement next to each other. It seems that there might be some criticism of the bishop because he's linked by his presence in this phrase and his placement next to this kind of lowly smith, a lay person, but also he's linked to beasts and particularly to the owl, which in the Middle Ages was a dirty bird. You would not want to be related or associated with owls. But the tricky thing about secondary sculpture's role as a memory aid is that we can see how these kinds of phrases are formed and how certain elements of sculpture are linked together, but we can seldom say for certain what they mean, what they're telling us. These are not our memories. These are not our sets of information plugged into these sculptures. Priests likely used and reused these carvings to impart messages to the congregation that would be seen on a daily basis and perhaps several times a day as people passed by the church, since these are exterior sculptures and the church is located right in the middle of town or in the village. But essentially, we are looking at someone else's memory palace. Like those memory palaces of Sally Schluter Tardella, and we don't know what hooks filled these images in most cases. I think I've got Tom Hiddleston, violence, and now the sex part. So sometimes we have a glimpse of the narrative hook or memory that is attached to a motif. One of the most surprising or shocking motifs in the language of corbels is the quite common, I'll call it coupling couple in polite company, seen in southwestern France. Why is this on a church? That's why it's puzzling. It's tempting to say that it warns people against having sex, but wouldn't this just make people think about having sex? And remember, the church is very careful about the message it projects. Something interesting about this motif, it is only found on little village churches. You will not find it on cathedrals or pilgrimage churches. So agrarian parishioners, or peasants, had strong oral vernacular culture, employing low humor and crude or bawdy storytelling traditions that included all manner of otherwise impolite or intimate bodily functions. So in order to gain and hold the interest of these kinds of people, the church had to learn to speak their language. And it was not uncommon in the Middle Ages for people to sneak away into the church in the middle of the day for a little indiscretion, because houses were not as private as they are today, and churches in these villages were usually empty and dark and cool in the middle of the afternoon. And we know that unauthorized use of the church building for lascivious encounters was a real concern to clergy, because penitentials are full of prescribed punishments for getting caught being naughty in the nave. And most interesting to me, morality tales circulated about this act. This particular narrative existed in many variations, but in each variation, the guilty couple always ends up getting stuck together. And the only thing that could unstick them was for them to be paraded around in public, for all of their neighbors to see, to mock, and eventually to pray for. And only when enough people prayed would the lovers become unstuck. And what better way to ensure that people pray as they go about their daily routines than to put this image from a very popular folktale on the church? As people pass by, they see the image of two people who are very much stuck together in flagrante delicto. They recall the tale, they say a quick prayer, and they continue on their way. It is likely that passers-by recognize their own indiscretions in these actions, or perhaps those of someone they knew, and they saw themselves in this publicly shamed couple, so they would want to say a quick prayer and perhaps squash the desire to repeat that indiscretion. Again, imagery instigates memory and action. Now, no records exist regarding the commission or justification of sculpture for these churches. So there is no way of knowing for sure that that's what this motif actually meant. But it's the only corbel figure I've found in all my years of looking at these that has a verifiable textual source that can be linked to use by the church and is not the standard bestiary or physiologus reference. So when we stand back and observe a Romanesque church from a classically prescribed distance, we see the perfect template for a memory palace. We can visualize the village priest instructing his congregation outside on a warm day, using the building itself as a visual aid to his lessons. We can imagine the congregation recalling those lessons as they pass by the church daily, or stopping to discuss a moral tale with their neighbors or say a quick prayer, using the church as a mnemonic device. What eludes us then today is what the lesson was. What were the memory hooks placed within each aspect of the 12th century village church? What lessons did people recall before these sculptures eventually lost their true didactic meaning? Like Sally Schluter Tardella's drawings, the Romanesque church acted as a memory palace, and we can see exactly where the mnemonic information has been placed. But because these are not our memories or our information to recall, we cannot say with certainty what messages these structures were meant to impart. Although the evidence for the mnemonic use of Romanesque sculpture is literally right there on the wall, the majority of its mnemonic content has, ironically, been forgotten. Thank you very much.